Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. This Pulp event podcast features a talk by Doug Ellis, co-founder of the Windy City Pulp and Paper Show. He discusses 120 years of the Argosy, the world's first pulp magazine. The presentation featured numerous examples of covers from Argosy magazine. Visit the Pulp event podcast page at the PulpNet for a link to a gallery of covers. This was recorded on July 23, 2016, at PulpFest 2016 in Columbus, Ohio.
All right, well, notwithstanding the name of this presentation, obviously this will not be a leisurely survey of Argosy. I'll generally avoid discussing artists or other topics that David Saunders touched on yesterday in his talk, but I'll deal with some other aspects of Argosy during its run. While the period primarily concerned with in my presentation tonight is with Argosy as a pulp, where it lasted for 47 years and over 1,500 issues, making it by far the pulp with the most issues, I'll take a brief look at the pre- and post-pulp periods as well. Now, this is Frank Muncie, the founder of Argosy. The magazine was his brainchild. He moved to New York City to start it up, but his money backer bailed out on him right at the last minute before it launched. He was fortunate to find another backer, but as a result, at first he was just an editor and manager. He did not have any ownership in the magazine. As editor, he edited for the first 4 years. But after the first 5 months, the publisher went broke. Muncie had been deferring his salary, and so he managed to basically purchase the magazine from the receiver by giving up his claim for the back monies that he was owed from the old publisher. This is a photo that ran back in 1926, shortly after Muncie's death. So this is the first issue. It was called The Golden Argosy. It's dated December 9th, 1882. It was on the newsstands a week earlier, so actually if you were alive back then, and I suspect nobody here was, even Walker, it would have been on the newsstands December 2nd. It was a newspaper format, 8 pages long, and it was really an illustrated weekly paper for boys. You can't really read it from that distance. I can't read it from this distance, but on the first page it launches with a start of a Horatio Alger serial. And Muncie's own career was pretty much like an Alger story. Poor boy makes good. As David pointed out yesterday, while he started basically nothing here, by the time he passed away in 1925, his estate was worth $40 million. Now here we're showing 2 representative issues of the early Golden Argosy, April 16th, 1887, and September 17th of 1887. During this period of time, the magazine ran stories of all types, many adventure stories, many Western stories. There were a few lost race stories as well. The page count gradually increased to 16 pages as it became a bit more successful. And the authors during this period, most of whom were well known in the dime novel days, pretty much unknown these days, included Horatio Alger, Edward Ellis, who was no relation to mine, unfortunately. Muncie himself wrote several stories. Oliver Optic, who was a very big author back in those days, William Murray Graydon, and also Matthew White Jr., who would end up editing Argosy for 42 years, from 1886 to 1928, which, 42-year record of editing a pulp, I think is a record. John Campbell, about the only guy I can think of who came close to that. As David mentioned yesterday, the art editor for the Muncie chain, C.H. Tate, also was with the Muncie chain for several decades, so he, White, and Muncie overlapped for many decades, making it one of the most stable teams in the pulps. With the December 1st, 1888 issue, it changed its name to the Argosy. It reduced its size from a newspaper size to more of a large magazine format. Page count increased up to 36 pages, and they underwent a few different cover design experiments during the next few years. Here's the July 13th, 1889 issue. It's really just a, sorry. This is the July 13th, 1889 issue, and you can't read it well, but what this talks about is you could write and order a bound volume for all of Argosy for Volume 7. For the first several years of its run, you could, after the end of each volume that ran, you could order an entire volume in hardcovers from the publisher. In 1891, Muncie launched Muncie's Weekly, which was another, his second magazine. It lasted 2 years before it converted to a monthly. Uh-oh. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. That might work. All right, here's the exciting September 27th, 1890 issue. For a period of time, they just ran ads on the cover. Very exciting. February 14th, 1891, they moved off the ads. They would do holiday-themed covers whenever holidays were appropriate. So this is a Valentine's Day cover. This is the January 30, 1892 issue. And February 27th, 1892 issue. This is at the time that Muncie's converted Muncie's Weekly into Muncie's Magazine, which became extremely popular, much more popular than Argosy, and really was the driver behind Muncie's rise to prominence in this period. It allowed him to end up doing some stuff with Argosy as well. The Muncie's Magazine was aimed more at adult audience, while Argosy at this point was still a juvenile audience in terms of its target. With the April 1894 issue, the format changed once again. This time it became a pulp-sized magazine, square-bound, but it was on a good quality paper, 108 pages, with photo covers, including this fine-looking dog. The last weekly issue was March 24th in 1894, and by the time of the last weekly, the circulation, which had reached a peak of 115,000 per issue a few years before, had plummeted to 9,000 copies per issue. So Muncie was pretty desperate with Argosy at this point. It was only selling 9,000 copies in issue and not doing well at all. With this change to format, within a month or two, the circulation jumped back up to 40,000. So it was a successful change. This is the February 1896 issue. It's the first issue with a table of contents cover. Fortunately, not a design that lasted long. Okay, this is the October 1896 issue, which was the first all-fiction magazine, and it's arguable whether this particular issue, October 1896, or this issue, which looks almost exactly the same, the December 1896 issue, was the first pulp. They're both the right format, but the October issue is on a better quality paper. The December issue is actually on a pulp paper. And within a short time, the circulation jumped up from 40,000 an issue to 80,000 an issue in this format. And just as an aside, about a dozen years ago, I was at a flea market in Buffalo, and I managed to find both the October and December 1896 issues at a flea market for $5 a piece. I was able to talk my wife into letting me buy them. This is the October 1898 issue, and this is the first time that Argosy absorbs another magazine, something which would happen many times in its run. As it's noted on the cover beneath the Argosy, it says, and the Peterson magazine, which was a magazine that had been published since 1842. And for the next 2 years, this is how Argosy was known on the newsstands, Argosy and the Peterson magazine. Show a few sample covers from the period now of November 1900 through September of 1905. These covers just had text, generally promoting stories or touting their growing circulation. So for this one, this edition is 130,000 copies, so it keeps doing better. This just talks about the various contents. And once again, a fact that Argosy is growing by leaps and bounds, and if you're not reading it, you're an idiot. In April of 1902, the second merger comes in. Muncie had launched a magazine called the Junior Muncie in 1897, magazine for older children, and that magazine failed after 5 years and merged into Argosy. And at this point, as I said, when it first flipped over to a pulp after a few months, circulation had increased to 80,000. Now, after 6 years as a pulp, 5.5 years really as a pulp, circulation is now up to 300,000 copies per issue. David showed this one last night as well. This is the October 1905 issue. It's the first Argosy pulp cover with an illustration. and it really, I think, changed to compete with the Popular magazine, which had been launched by Street and Smith in November of 1903, and which was the first pulp that had painted covers. Popular was an immediate success, and for the next 2 decades, really, Argosy and Popular generally, with some exceptions here and there, but they generally had the highest circulation in the pulps. Usually Argosy was #1 during that period, Popular #2, but occasionally Popular was the pulp with the highest circulation. I'm going to show a few representative covers from the next period here. So this is June of 1906. It's one of many medieval covers, and the pulps weren't always politically correct. So up top here, no place for a woman. April 1907 was one of many ship covers. Again, for years, Argosy would use ship designs for mastheads or for logos for various things, harkening back to Jason and the Argonauts. The letter column in Argosy, once they ran one, was initially called the logbook. They eventually changed it, however, to the Argo Notes. This is the December 1907 issue, marking a return to the all-text cover for at least one issue. But it touts the 25th anniversary, and that circulation has now reached 500,000 copies per issue. Inside, it ran a history of the magazine to that point that was written by Muncie, and the second best pulp convention in the country, Windy City, ran this article in our program book this year. I just threw this one there because I like it. It's January 1908. January 1909. At this period, they were primarily running historical fiction, mysteries, general adventure, westerns, sprinkling of SF, not too much science fiction yet at this point. February 1910, another ship cover, and I just love the lettering on this. I just think it's very elegant and interesting. They did a lot of interesting design things at this point in its run. March 1910, similarly, covers in this period just had this sort of elegant feel to them. Certainly much different than what you would see 20, 30 years later. Here you've got a medieval knight. 20 or 30 years later, you'd be locked in combat. Somebody would have an axe in their hands, and somebody would be about to die. In July 1910, they switched over to a new cover design. Actually, it began in May 1910. This is the July 1910 issue, however. And for the next year and a half, every cover image was framed by either a square or a circle. It alternated months depending on which it was, a square or a circle. And this is actually the first science fiction cover that ever ran on Argosy. It didn't run very many science fiction covers compared to its companion titles, All Story and Cavalier, but it did run some science fiction covers. The editor of Cavalier and All Story, Robert Davis, was really the first important editor as far as the science fiction field ran, as those two magazines actually ran quite a bit of science fiction. The science fiction story here, Around the World in 24 Hours, is written by Stephen Angus Cox. Obviously, I don't need to tell anybody here who he is. He's well known to this day as a legend. August 1911, the first baseball cover on Argosy. So science fiction beat out baseball, at least here. December 1912 was their first full-color cover. This one's by artist Rolf Bull. So Mr. Bull is apparently an answer to a pulp trivia question coming up. This also has part 3 of Castaways of the Year 2000 by William Wallace Cook. Cook was a very popular author in the pulps at this period for the Muncie chain, primarily, although he did stuff for Street and Smith and others. He wrote in all genres, but to the extent he's remembered today, it's remembered for his science fiction stories. And at this point in time, in 1912, the average monthly circulation was being maintained at around 500,000 copies per issue. This is the July 1914 issue. At this point, they're really transitioning from the earlier look and earlier fiction they were running. They're starting to run some authors that people really do still remember. So this is the first cover for one of H. Bedford Jones' most popular series characters, John Solomon. the amiable Cockney who was an undercover British government operative. And it's really a toss-up, I think, as to whether Bedford Jones or Max Brand was the most prolific writer for the pulps. I suspect Ed Hulse could tell us, but both those guys just turned out tremendous amounts of material. June 1915, another John Solomon cover. This is September 1914, Zane Grane on the cover. He was, at the time, perhaps the most popular Western author of the early 20th century, and his work really idealized the American frontier. This particular issue appeared about 2 years after his Riders of the Purple Sage, which really launched his fame. July 1915, there's two stories mentioned on here. The first, if I can find the pointer. There we go. Froth of Dreams by James Francis Dwyer. Dwyer was a popular writer of adventure stories for a lot of the different pulps. He was an Australian who'd spent some time in jail. He was convicted of forgery in 1899, sentenced to 7 years. He served 3 of them, and he began writing when he got out of jail and moved to the U.S. It also features a story by Fred Jackson. Jackson was a prolific writer for the Muncie pulps, and H.P. Lovecraft hated his stories. They were very sentimental. Lovecraft thought they were a bit erotic, which if you read them today, there's really nothing erotic about them, but I guess for 1915, maybe they were. And Lovecraft criticized them in several letters to Argosy, including one where he wrote a long verse ripping on Jackson. And Jackson's supporters chimed in the letters column in defense of Jackson. It created a bit of a flame war. Today, if it was on Facebook or something, it'd be people defriending each other left and right, but eventually it settled down. Jackson was, however, a very popular author for the Muncie chain, notwithstanding Lovecraft's sentiments. And he was paid 2 years before this for the story, The First Law, which was an April 13 issue, $1,250, which was for a novel, and today would be about $30,000. So he was doing all right back in the day. Here's the September 1916 issue, proving that William Wallace Cook also wrote non-science fiction. So the June 1917 cover, it's a patriotic cover, obviously, and America had just entered the war in April of 1917. This issue would have been in the newsstands in May of 17, so I suspect the art editor at Quick told his artist to whip up a patriotic cover in connection with America entering the war. As an aside, Argosy managed to generally avoid the fate of All Story and Blue Book and Adventure and some others in the mid-teens on its covers. Those pulps often published portraits of pretty women on the cover, which looked nice enough, but really had nothing to do with the contents and really weren't terribly appropriate for a adventure fiction magazine. At this time, artists doing covers for Argosy were getting about $125 per cover, which by 1920 had increased to $140 a cover. So in today's money, it's about $2,000 a cover for an artist. The circulation at this point had dropped, and Popular actually was in 1917 the more popular pulp. Circulation now is about 220,000 a copy. This is October 6th, 1917. It's the first weekly issue, and that's what the lovely announcement is discussing, that they're going back to weekly. The last monthly issue was also dated October 1917, so if you're collecting, there's actually 5 October issues. The first one has no date beyond October, however. November 10, 1917 features a story by Frederick Faust, writing as Max Brand, and certainly he's best known for his westerns, but he wrote a lot of other genres as well, including a lot of historical stuff for the Muncie pulps, including this one. February 2, 1918, Victor Rousseau, another popular and prolific author for the Muncie chains. He wrote many genres. I'm not sure what Fruit of the Lamp is. I know what Fruit of the Loom is, but Fruit of the Lamp, just don't know. May 4th, 1918, Johnson McCulley, who's best known for creating Zorro, which he created the next year in 1919, and All Story, is here with another tale of Central America, but it's set long before the Zorro stories. June 15th, 1919, this is a story, a cover for a story by another popular author at the time, Charles Stilson. He's perhaps best known for Polaris of the Snow stories, which appeared in All Story and were competitors of Tarzan. He also wrote a lot of historical romances like this one. October 5th, 1918, the smaller story mentioned up in the upper left is Peter the Brazen by George Warts. It's the first story of Peter the Brazen, who was probably Warts' most popular series character about American Peter Moore, a radio operator and engineer in China who had many fantastic adventures over there. The true cover story, though, is the one in the bottom right by Captain A.E. Dingle, who was a seafarer in real life, spent 22 years at sea, not consecutively. Was shipwrecked many times, and he wrote sea stories for many pulps. Right about this time, in the late teens, his wife and daughter were in England. He was living in the U.S., and he began a relationship with a woman. One day they were out sailing in the Atlantic alone, and he says when he came up on deck, she was gone, she must have fallen overboard, never found her, and apparently he was believed. He was never charged with anything. December 14th, 1918, Robert Ames Bennett's Sultana of Marib. Like many stories that appeared in Argosy or novels, this was published in book form. It's a lost race. Bennett wrote several of those, as well as westerns. December 28th, 1918, Ahmed Abdullah appears with this tale, The Web. He was, like many of the folks I've discussed, a prolific contributor to the monthly magazines. Abdullah claimed descent from the Russian royal family, immigrated to the U.S. in 1910. The chances he really was a Russian royal family member are about slim and none, and I think Slim just rode out of town. He also became a successful screenwriter later in the day, and several of his stories have fantastic elements, and many are set in the Middle East. Okay, so one of Muncie's other titles, Railroad Man's Magazine, began back in 1906. It was really the first specialized pulp. Here's two sample covers from it from the teens. This one's October 1918. This one's December 28th of 1918. And as you can see, several of the covers, and in fact the stories that ran in there were not related to railroads at all. There's a great Viking story that ran about this time in a Railroad Man's Magazine for some bizarre reason. But the reason I mention it and show it is because with the January 25th, 1919 issue, it merges into Argosy, which now becomes Argosy and Railroad Man's Magazine. The combined title runs until May 24th of 1919, so about 5 months under this title, and then they drop in Railroad Man's Magazine. July 26th, 1919, Isle of Drums by J. Allen Dunn. Dunn was another prolific writer, particularly adventure stories, westerns, wrote for basically all the pulps. He had spent time by this time in both Hawaii and the West. He was a friend of Jack London. He was apparently more than a friend of Jack London's wife. He left San Francisco early in the teens in a bit of a cloud when it was discovered that he was, a lot of his friends were fairly wealthy, and he would go to their parties and steal jewelry from them when nobody was paying attention. They set him up when they realized it was probably him. He got busted in the act, but his friends didn't want to cause a scandal, so no charges were pressed so long as he agreed to move back out east. October 11th, 1919, David showed this cover yesterday. I showed it, I think, for the same reason, just because I think it's very cool. It's by Garrett Smith, Between Worlds. Smith wrote a lot of early SF stories from the Muncie chain. March 13th, 1920, a tale by Charles Eldon Sulster, who another popular Western pulp writer of the time. April 17th of 1920, Naked Men of Naga, not pictured on the cover, or if they are, the shield is covering a lot. This one's by Gordon McCrae, who was a popular writer of adventure tales, and he'd spent a lot of time in the Far East before this. He was trapping live animals, doing a lot of stuff in the Far East, was involved in some early attempts at filming in the Far East. And he wrote, in addition to his pulps, he wrote some great nonfiction travel books, particularly in the 1920s, about South America. And for Adventure magazine in the 1920s, he explored Abyssinia, looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And he was later made a Knight of the Empire by the Ethiopian Emperor. He was born in Indiana, and some think he was an inspiration for Indiana Jones. Certainly they both were looking for the Ark of the Covenant, but to all accounts, McCrae did not find it. So the June 12th, 1920 issue, featuring a cover story by Harold Lamb, Caravan of the Dead. Lamb, very well known still today as a writer of historical adventure fiction. He did do work for Argosy, obviously, like this piece, but primarily his pulp output is much more associated with adventure, particularly his series about Klit the Cossack, but wrote several other series as well. And eventually he graduated to writing for the Slicks and a number of best-selling books. Here's a check that Lamb received from Muncie for the Lake of Long Dreams from All Story in 1918 for $100. It was a relatively short story. In the teens and the 20s, the top word rates were actually much higher than they were in the 30s. So for this story, he got $100, which would be about $1,700 today. This June 19th, 1920 issue features Frances Stevens Serapion. She didn't really write that much, but she's very well regarded even today for her fantasy stories. She was really the first major female writer of science fiction and fantasy in the U.S. Her real name was Gertrude Bennett, but I guess she thought that Frances Stevens sounded much better, and I think I probably agree with that. The last issue with this cover design, they're about to they're about to change designs. Is next month. The July 17th, 1920 issue is the last time that Argosy looks like this. With the July 24th issue, it's going to merge with All Story Weekly. And before discussing that, I'm going to take a quick, brief look at All Story and the pulps that merged into it. Take notes on this. There will be a test. I know it's quick, but you all can see fine. I can see fine. You can see fine. So this is The Ocean, August of 1907. It was the second specialized pulp after Railroad Stories. It only ran for 11 issues, though, from 1907 to 1908. Retitled The Live Wire with February 1908 issue. And there's The Live Wire, which is a magazine that is going some. It's a general fiction magazine. Had actually color interior illustrations, which is highly unusual. And it only ran for 8 issues, so I guess it was going some and then it went. Ran for 8 issues before it merged into the scrapbook in October of 1908. So here's the scrapbook, December of 1907, second section. And when you say, what the hell's the second section? They had a bizarre idea with the scrapbook. Starting in 1906, they published it, or rather, the magazine itself started in 1906, but beginning in July of 1907, they published the scrapbook in 2 sections. So there were 2 separate magazines, each the size of a regular pulp, basically. And the first section was nonfiction, the second section was fiction. But it was a horrible idea. On the newsstands, you really couldn't keep the 2 sections together easily. So I think news dealers hated it, and the 2-section idea lasted until September of 1908, so just over a year, when the second section they finally gave up on and they just merged it into the Cavalier. So here's Cavalier, the June 1909 issue. The Cavalier was launched in October of 1908, which took over for the fiction section of the scrapbook. It became a weekly in January 6th of 1912 when the rest of the scrapbook merged into it. So here you can see it's the Cavalier with also the scrapbook. And then Cavalier itself merged into the All Story with the May 9th, 1914 issue. So now finally we get to All Story Weekly. This is the February 15th, 1919 issue. Fantastic cover, in my opinion, for Merritt's Conquest of the Moon Pool. All Story had begun back in 1905, and under editor Bob Davis had featured a lot more planetary romance and fantasy than Argosy. Many of the regular authors wrote science fiction and fantasy, such as Merritt here and more particularly Edgar Rice Burroughs. The last issue of it was July 17th, 1920, and with the merger, several authors who had appeared to that time only in either All Story or Cavalier now finally started appearing in Argosy as well. So this is the August 7th, 1920 issue. Magazine is now retitled Argosy All Story Weekly. For some bizarre reason I've never understood to this day, on the cover you can see the hyphen between all and story. On the spine, the hyphen is between Argosy and all. So God only knows what they were thinking. This is another Merritt story. So his first appearance in Argosy is for the metal monster. His original title was The Metal Emperor. Merritt was purportedly the highest paid author in the Muncie chain. For this particular story, he received $1,000. Or about $12,500 today. And the original for this cover still exists. There it is. It's by P.J. Monahan, although he did it under the name Glenn White for some reason. He did this a few times, and you can't see from, it's too small here, but there's Glenn White's signature, and if you look carefully at the original, you can see where Monahan's been painted over the Monahan signature. At this time, Argosy was paying starting word rates of a cent a word, but authors like H. Bedford Jones, some of the bigger names, were getting 5 or 6 cents a word, which was not bad money back in those days. So, I mean, for a 10,000 word novelette, even at a cent a word, it's $100 or basically $1,250 today, whereas Bedford Jones making 6 cents a word is pulling in about $7,500 a story in today's dollars. February 21st, 1921 issue, Tarzan the Terrible. It's the first appearance of Burroughs in Argosy. This had actually been accepted by Bob Davis before he left Muncie after the merger of All Story and Argosy made Davis more or less obsolete. Burroughs received $3,000 for this story, which translates to about $36,500 today. May 14th, 1921, The Blind Spot by Austin Hall, Homer Ian Flint. Like Merritt and Burroughs, they were regular writers of science fiction from All Story. But lest you think that Muncie, and the Muncie editors had science fiction down, they did make some mistakes. Right around this time, they rejected E.E. Doc Smith's Skylark of Space. They wrote to him that it was too far out. November 19th, 1921. Like this one here, a lot of Argosy stories were made into movies or written from movie scripts. And again, tough to see, but down here it talks about this as a George D. Baker presentation coming at the movie starring some guy, Gareth Hughes, who frankly I've never heard of, but maybe he was big back in the day. So they often cross-promoted things like this in an effort, I think, both to increase circulation, and I suspect that the movie studios were probably involved to some degree as well. December 3, 1921, The Wreck. Auto stories were relatively popular at this time still. The autos were still relatively new, and most of them had some sort of humorous element with cars crashing, because that's always fun. December 10, 1921, we'd seen a Max Brand non-Western. Here he is doing what he does best, a Western with Black Jack. February 18th, 1922, Chessmen of Mars by Burroughs was the first John Carter story in Argosy. All the earlier ones had appeared in All Story. He actually got a little more for this than he did for Tarzan the Terrible. This one he was paid $3,500 for, which in 1922 would equate to about $48,000 today. Bob Davis, after leaving All Story, became an agent, and Burroughs had engaged him for this story. He told Davis to offer it around to people for $10,000. Surprisingly, nobody took it. Popular was one of the other magazines that turned it down at the $10,000 price, but $3,500 or $48,000 today is still not chump change for this story. So the May 6, 1922 issue, Johnson McCulley's second Zorro story, The Further Adventures of Zorro, although inside it's spelled correctly. On the cover, Zorro is Z-O-R-O. So I suspect that intern lasted about one issue. It does mention the upcoming movie with Douglas Fairbanks in the lead. And at this point, during 1922, circulation had bounced back. They were back up to 470,000 copies per issue sold. Undoubtedly, a lot of that to do with the fact that with the merger of All Story and a lot of fan favorites are now making appearances in All Story, rather in Argosy as well, so boosting circulation. All right, this one I had to include. This is the September 15th, 1923 issue, and I've got no freaking clue who thought this was a good idea. So this is for the story Cheddar Cheese, which I know you've all read. And the tagline here is, something that goes with the pie. So, you know, this woman's reading the newspaper, she's a little startled. The guy looks really startled, his hand looks deformed. But I don't know, maybe he's only tried Swiss cheese before, now cheddar cheese is coming to him, I just don't know. But I've not read it, but Diggs Latouche, your task is to read the story and report back next year. This is an ad for the December 15th, 1923 issue, advertising that Clarence Mulford's Hopalong Cassidy is coming to that issue of Argosy All Story. Cassidy obviously is a famous character for decades, appeared in pulps, books, movies, every other form of media known to man, probably be in live streaming if it was done today. And this is a window card that would have been given to newsstands back in the day to put up advertising the issue so people would know it was out with a new Hopalong issue. And most of the pulp chains did advertising ephemera like this. Unfortunately, most of it hasn't survived. It was intended to be thrown away right away. Generally, it's on a thin cardboard, sometimes even on a cloth, and they just didn't make it. But this one survived in remarkably good shape all this time. Another type of advertising piece that publishers would often give to dealers were cloth banners. This particular one is touting Tarzan and the Ant-Man, which began in February 2 of 1924. And the banners are quite large, particularly compared to the cardboard signs. This is probably about 2 feet by 3 feet. And it's on a very, very thin cloth. Again, amazing these things survive, but they would have been blanketing your newsstands if you were hovering around them in 1924. And here's one more of them. This one's for a little bit later that year, April 26, 1924, and it actually shows the issue itself. And you can read the world's greatest all-fiction weekly at a popular price of 10 cents. This is the August 9th, 1924 issue. J.U. Geisey and Junius Smith present here with a story about their character Semi-Duel, another popular character which moved over to Argosy, which had first appeared in the Cavalier. Semi-Duel was a Persian occult investigator, so he was a pretty cool dude. It notes here on the cover that Semi-Duel solves the Neptune equation. I am not sure if he also solved the three-body equation or not, but we can read it and find out later. This is a poster for the all-fiction field, which was started in 1918 by 4 pulp publishers, Doubleday, Muncie, Ridgway, and Street and Smith, to increase ad revenue. And the deal was that you would buy ad space in all pulps of all of those 4 chains at the same time through a central arrangement. So if you instead of having to deal with 4 different magazines, 4 different publishers, you just had one contact to deal with, and you would get your ad in all of the pulps that those publishers published. When it was launched, the publishers did a lot of promo in various magazines, and in some of that it is stated that $7.5 million is spent each year by 1.8 million customers buying the magazines of those 4 publishers on 38,000 newsstands across the country. The combined ad rate, if you wanted to buy a full-page ad back then, was $1,300, which would be about $22,500 to buy a full-page ad. And this particular poster was part of a packet given to prospective advertisers in 1925. And you can see down at the bottom it says Listerine advertising is appearing in these 16 magazines, and 13 million people are theoretically reading them. On the back of the poster, it has some quotes from Listerine talking about what a great thing it is that they've been advertising with the all-fiction field and how everybody should be doing it. February 6th of 1926, story The Seal of Satan. This was by author question mark. An unidentified author, presumably did this to sort of drum up interest or mystery, and they liked the idea so much that a few months later they did another one by this guy. It ultimately was revealed the author was Fred McIsaac, who was a regular Argosy author. I have no idea if it worked well or not, but they did stop it after 2 issues, so my suspicion is it did not do quite what they wanted it to do. This is actually the next issue, February 13th of 1926, and the block text at the top says the story of Frank A. Muncie begins in this issue. He had passed away 2 months earlier on December 22nd of 1925, and so with this issue, Argosy begins running a long article about him through several issues. The company was taken over by William Dewart, and as David mentioned yesterday, Muncie's will stated that the magazines in the Muncie chain, which included not just Argosy but many newspapers and other magazines, were not to be sold for 7 years to avoid a fire sale and hopefully maximize the price when they were sold. So with the April 17, 1926 issue, cover changed to this format. This is the February 12, 1927 issue. So now Muncie has passed away a year later, or rather 4 months after he passes away. The cover design they've ran for the previous 6 years now changes to this, so I suspect that this may have been something that White had wanted to maybe do for a bit, but Muncie had been resisting. Muncie now doesn't resist, he's dead. This is really the first war cover they've run in a long time. They were really pretty rare before this, but now they've become fairly common. I think in part because war pulps were starting to come out at this time. War pulps were very popular, and Argosy wanted to compete with them as well. And the whole feel of the cover starts to change at this time as well. They become much less sedate. They start moving towards more action as we keep moving to the 30s, and that trend continues. And the fiction starts moving that way a bit too, particularly after June 9th of 1928, which is when White's 42-year run as editor ends. So Muncie dies in 26. The editor for 42 years, White resigns in 28. So a 2-year period, a lot of upheaval in the magazine. And White was replaced by Archibald Bittner, who formerly had been with Short Stories and Frontier. Before that, he'd been an editor with Adventure. In the 1930s, after he left Argosy, he wrote Weird Menace as Wayne Rogers, and he actually wrote several Spider and Operator 5 novels. But as editor of Argosy, he brought a lot of adventures authors over to Argosy, folks he had worked with back when he was editing under Hoffman at Adventure, especially Talbot Mundy. This is the November 11th, 1928 issue, and the story He Rules Who Can by Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur. Brodeur, it's his first appearance in Argosy, but he was a regular with Adventure, again, where Bittner knew him from, and undoubtedly Bittner brought him over. Brodeur wrote a lot of historical adventure for Adventure. He was a professor at University of California at Berkeley, and one of the few academics, I guess, writing for the Pulps at the time. December 8th, 1928, W. worked with Warlord of Many Swordsmen. Wrote a lot of stories set in China against the backdrop of warlords. His most famous series featured American Jimmy Cordy and his band. Lots of parallels with that group with Doc Savage's crew. I actually wrote an article about it probably about 20 years ago at this point for PulpFest, if you can find the damn thing. But the original cover for this one by Paul Starr still exists, and there it is. February 16th, 1929, The Cardinal's Curse by J.A. Allen Dunn, another pirate tale. Dunn was another author who had been absent from Argosy for many, many years, and he became a regular back when Bittner assumed things. So Bittner's obviously looking through his index cards, calling up all his old author buddies from Adventure and Short Stories and Frontier and saying, come over to Argosy. As I said, the most successful or the largest author he brought over was Talbot Mundy. This is April 27th, 1929, for a monkey cover story by Allah, Who Made Tigers. May 11th of 29, a cover story featuring a story by Ralph Milne Farley, one of his Radio Man series, which was a popular series, ran for many years in the magazine. And another author on the cover, William Merriam Rouse, had been absent from Argosy for 6 years, and Bittner brings him back as well. And I don't know if you really see this text here says, text here says that the magazine is the property of the Fox Studio Library. The movie studios mined the pulps for stories for decades, and all the major studios would get the leading pulps in and keep them in their library, and people would mine them for story ideas. So at one point, this particular issue was owned by the Fox Studio Library. May 18th, 1929, an Underworld cover. Again, that, like with the war stories, the war pulps, the Underworld was starting to gain traction as a pulp genre around this time, becoming popular. And so Argosy also began running some more stories and covers featuring the Underworld. Frank Packard, the author of it, was another author who had been absent from Argosy for 5 years. Bittner brought him back, and Packard still sort of remembered, I guess, today, mostly for his Jimmy Dale series. June 22nd, 1929, Ray Cummings' Shadow Girl, one of his many science fiction stories that he had appearing in Argosy. Shortly after this, a couple months later, September 28th of 29, is the last issue with All Story on the cover. As you've been noticing, the words All Story Weekly have been getting smaller and smaller over the last year or two. And 3 months from now, it's going to disappear entirely. And in a really bizarre move. I'm not quite sure why they did things this way, but it was, I guess, a good idea to somebody. The Muncie's, which was a pulp at this time, merged into Argosy All Story Weekly in October of 29, and then Muncie's and All Story Weekly spun out as All Story combined with Muncie, and that became a love pulp in October 5 of 1929, which just leaves Argosy as Lonely Argosy. This is the December 21st, 1929 issue. For Otis Adalbert Klein's Mazza of the Moon on the cover. Klein was really considered to be Burroughs' biggest competitor in the late 20s, early 30s. He wrote a lot of stories set on Venus, on Mars. He had a serious character, Jan of the Jungle, not to be confused with Tarzan of the Jungle, unless you really want to. And the original cover by Robert Graff of this still exists, and there it is. And the sad news is I do not own it. I did make a very good trade-off on it recently, and the owner foolishly rejected it, so may he burn. This is the January 25th, 1930 issue. Bedford Jones returns with John Solomon. Argosy had been trying to get Jones to return with a Solomon story for a while, and Bittner was successful in getting him to do it. Bittner also managed to bring back a number of other serious characters at this time. Peter the Brazen, who hadn't appeared since the late teens, returns 2 issues later. Zorro, who had been absent for 7 or 8 years, returns next year. Semi-Duel had just returned the year earlier. And in addition to bringing back a lot of the old popular series characters, as well as bringing over a lot of his old writers from Adventure and short stories and Frontier, Bittner was also looking for new blood. He was advertising in writers' magazines at the time that Argosy was a good market for new writers. At this point, word rates are starting at 1.5 cents a word and up. But unlike the situation a decade earlier, there's really not much up. Unless you were one of the really top guys, you're pretty much worth a cent and a half a word. But at that rate, 10,000 words novelette nets you $150, which today would be about $2,000. May 3rd, 1930. Features on the cover a Foreign Legion story by Theodore Roscoe, The Death Watch. Roscoe wrote a lot of Legion stories for Argosy, particularly the series character Thibaut Corday, which are just great stuff. I think Altus has reprinted all the Corday stories in a number of volumes. During the 30s, Argosy ran a lot of Foreign Legion stories by a number of regular writers of them. George Surdez, one of them, Robert Carson, another. and also J.D. Newsome. And Pulp author Hugh Cave thought that Newsome's Legion stories were among the best stories in the pulps. This is the July 5th, 1930 issue. It features a story on the cover by Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, who not only was a pulp author, he was a pioneer in the American comic books industry. His National Allied Publications eventually became DC Comics. Unfortunately for him, it was after he lost control of it to his printer, Harry Donenfeld. So while Superman made Donenfeld a ton of money, Nicholson not so much. October 11th, 1930. This is another of George Wart's series characters, lawyer Gillian Hazeltine. And I gotta tell you, here you got Hazeltine in front of this idol in, I don't know, the South Seas or somewhere interesting. And it's pretty much a typical exciting life for a lawyer. People ask me a lot, what life as a lawyer is like, and I show them this cover and say, this is pretty much what I do every day. February 28th, 1931, this features the story Bonds of the Northland by Robert Pinkerton. Pinkerton wrote both by himself as well as with his wife, Catherine. And they really knew what they were talking about when they wrote about the Northwest, which was the general setting for their stories. Back in the teens, they had built a cabin up in northern Canada where they lived for many years, and it was accessible only by boat in the summer or by dog sled in the winter. May 16th of 31, Pirate of Wall Street. Perhaps not surprisingly, given that the stock market had crashed just a few years earlier, Argosy occasionally ran crime stories centered around financial markets. The original painting by Starr of this also still exists. And at this time, Paul Starr was getting $250 per cover painting, which would equate to about $3,600 today. So that's what he was paid for this. December 16th of 31, at the top, touting W.C. Tuttle's Wild Oats. Tuttle wrote a lot of humorous westerns for a lot of the pulps. For Argosy, he had a series character, Sheriff Henry Harrison Conroy. The issue also features a Mountie story, which is a regular type of story that ran in Argosy a lot. Also features a story by Ralph Perry at the bottom. Perry wrote a lot of stories about the South Seas, especially had a series character, Bellow Bill Williams, which I've always liked quite a bit. And Matt, if you're out there listening, I've always thought those should be reprinted. 2 months before this issue ran, Bittner was replaced as editor, so his run was relatively short. It was replaced by Don Moore, and Moore's biggest claim to fame probably is between 1934 and 54. He was the idea man behind Flash Gordon and Jungle Jim. This is the September 17th, 1932 issue featuring Pirates of Venus, the first of the Venus stories. Burroughs had worked out a deal with Muncie to come back to the pages of Argosy, and so he pre-sold, great deal for him, before he even wrote them, 3 novels to Moore to get him to come back. This one was actually written first, but was published second. Tarzan's story, which was written second, was published first because when the deal got signed, Moore immediately touted that Tarzan was going to be returning, and so they wanted the first story to appear to be a Tarzan. Grafe did the cover for this, got $175, and I've got 5 minutes, so I got to fly. October 15th, 32, Earl Stanley Garner, Chinatown Mystery. Garner did a lot of stuff for them during the years. April 31, 33, Ernest Haycock's popular Western author. July 22 of 33, T.S. Stribling's Railroad. Stribling wrote a lot for the pulps, but he also won the Pulitzer in 33, so not all pulp writers were confined to the pulps. July 29 of 33, one of Carl Detzer's several fireman stories that he wrote for both the pulps as well as Saturday Evening Post. August 5th of 33, Hulbert Footner wrote a number of stories concerning Madame Rosika Story, a female detective, unusual back in the day. October 7th, 33, Albert Payson Terhune, a number of dog stories, starting with Lad, a dog, back in many years earlier. And by now, Don Moore's been replaced as editor by Albert Gibney. He'd been with Muncie since he started as an ad rep in the teens. Eventually, Gibney becomes co-publisher and managing editor of all the Muncie pulps. doesn't last long as the actual editor. He's replaced in 1934 by Frederick Clayton, who had been with Short Stories. May 26th of 34, George Wart's third major series character, Singapore Sammy, the original. March 9th of 35, George Bruce, one of the more famous aviation pulp writers, also wrote for Argosy as well as basically all the aviation pulps. In this period, we've not talked much about interior art, but interior artists at this time were getting about $13 a piece for interior illos, so about 230 bucks if you did an interior illustration. Another Max Brand story, although this time writing is George Chalice, his Firebrand series from April of 35. June 15, 35, F.V.W. Mason, who just wrote a ton of historical stories for Argosy. This one set back to the time of Alexander the Great. October 3 of 36, Hubbard is mentioned, L. Ron Hubbard, as Mr. Luck at the top right. He wrote several stories for Argosy. This issue also has a story inside by Robert E. Howard. Earlier in the year, the editor had changed once again. Here they went 42 years with one editor, and like they've gone through 5 in about 6 years. Jack Byrne has now taken over. He'd been at Fiction House for a lot of years before that. At Fiction House, Robert E. Howard sold him a lot of stuff, and when Byrne took over at Argosy, he got Howard back into the pages of Argosy with several stories. December 5th, 36, Lester Dent, one of his 3 appearances with Hades, obviously Dent most well known for Doc Savage. May 1 of 37, one of Judson Phillips' several sports stories. He wrote sports stories of all types for the magazine, and Byrne is now gone as editor, replaced by Chandler Whipple. August 28th of 37, this is one of several future war covers that Argosy ran in the late 30s, which featured America either threatened or conquered. And I think I saw on the TV last week that some of these covers were featured during the RNC. The red band at the top of the cover is now gone, and Argosy at this point is really is experimenting. They've been losing circulation. They're trying different things out to try and regain circulation. Bolarski, who's the artist on this, is getting $125 to $150 a cover, which is about half what Paul Starr was getting 6 years earlier. December 18th of 37, both Cornell Woolrich and Hubbard on the cover. Woolrich mostly known for detectives, obviously. January 29th of 38, Luke Short gets the cover, obviously a very popular Western writer. At this time, Argosy cuts their rates to a 1 1/4 cent a word. So again, trying to save a little money. And their up now is really very, very little up. September 17th, 38, one of the Horatio Hornblower stories, which were very popular. And at this time, Argosy ran a poll asking their writers to write in for what the most popular story had ever been to appear in a monthly pulp. Number 2 was Tarzan of the Apes. Number 1 was A. Merritt's Ship of Ishtar, which he had received $175 for back in 1919. And they took the occasion of that being voted the most popular story to reprint it. And they then realized if we reprint things, we can save money. So from that point on, they started reprinting stories, saving some costs. September 24th, 38, another monthly pulp, All-American Fiction, merges into Argosy. December 10th of 38, this is the logo Argosy would use for a short time where it talks about All-American Fiction merging in. You can see there's a note there that the 39 Steps is being reprinted. This particular cover was later reprinted on the first issue of the monthly pulp Foreign Legion Adventures, trying to save some money. And this particular cover, as well as 5 other covers from Argosy, hold out hope, guys. They were found about 2 years ago in an estate sale in a Pennsylvania backyard leaning up against a chain link fence for about $50 a piece. So they're still out there, keep looking. At this time, cover artists are being paid $100, which again was down from the $250 they were getting at the start of the decade. The first of William Gray Bear's Minions of the Moon series, Minions of the Moon. June of 1940, Max Brand, Dr. Kildare's story, another popular series. August 3, 1940. Here's where they're really going into cost-cutting measures. New cover design, it's mostly text. Obviously, they're not paying anybody going forward to do covers because they're just going to reuse the same one. Also at this time, they did something really stupid. As circulation declined, they began reducing the print run. They figured if they were printing 200,000 copies and selling 100,000, so they were getting 100,000 returns, if they reduced the print run, they'd still sell the same number, but reduce the number of returns. But they didn't target it right across the country, so it really didn't work. All it meant was that they kept selling fewer and fewer copies because they kept printing fewer and fewer copies. So it was a bit of a spiral down. January 18th of 41, they've tried something new. It's now changed to a bed sheet, stapled. It's a little bigger magazine, uses less paper, it's less expensive. However, they claim they're giving you more words. August of 41, still with the bed sheet. Cover illustrations resume, but they're not in full color. Again, cost savings. This particular one's by Virgil Finley, who did a couple covers in the time. June of 42, full color covers resume. But they often run photographic covers as well. This particular one's by H.J. Ward, and David talked about that quite a bit. And by now, the nonfiction content's increasing. I suspect that it was cheaper. And so on the cover here, there's no fiction mentioned even. Also, publication is now down to monthly. It shifted to monthly with the May of 42 issue after 25 years as a weekly. In January 43, or actually in late 42, Popular Publications bought the monthly Pulps. It was announced on September 28th of 42, and this is the first Popular Publications issue, January 43. They brought it back to pulp size, briefly resumed all fiction policy. Rogers Terrell took over as the editor. This is the August 43 issue, which was the last pulp issue, featuring a story on the cover by Hamlin Daly, who was really E. Hoffman Price. And inside there's an announcement that the next issue will be the new supersized Argosy. And it goes into great detail talking about how great it will be for fiction to have this new classy look. So that's the first slick issue. At first, it really did run a lot of the same authors, still was primarily a fiction magazine, gradually shifted away from that as time went on to become more of a men's magazine. July 45, Steger's taken over as editor directly at this point, still running a lot of fiction though. April 48. February of 54, by now inside, it's down to 4 pieces of fiction. Nonfiction is by far the majority of the content. March of 59, at the top, it bills itself as the largest selling fiction fact magazine for men. Should really switch that around, fact fiction magazine for men. Now here's an interesting one. These are 2 cigarette lighters with the Argosy logo on them, and in one of them, a bunch of people are reading Argosy magazines. These came out, I think, in the early 60s, but I've not been able to verify it. But I do know, however, that the Zippo is unconditionally guaranteed. In this period, February 64, Argosy becomes the first magazine or anything to use the phrase the Bermuda Triangle. April 1970, they're down to running 1 piece of fiction per issue. They do run an article about the real-life Tarzan, who's some a white guy who lives with a South American tribe, but it's really not quite Tarzan of the Apes from October 1912 All Story, is it? June of 74, once again, still only 1 piece of fiction, although at least they have an article on Dick Tracy. And the final issue, November of 79, there were some issues after this that were put out by different publishers trying to revive the title. None of them really ever worked for more than a couple of issues. So that's the end of their 97-year run, and I think I've gone a little past my 45-minute run. So thank you all very much.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2016.